welcome. My name is Dr. Amy Banks, and I am a psychiatrist in Lexington, Massachusetts, and one of the founding members of the International Center for Growth and Connection. And today I'm going to share with you sort of some of the work that I've been doing for the past 20 years, and I think it's not ever been more relevant, actually, than it is right now, both because of the COVID pandemic, but also because of the extensive protests across the country, protesting police violence, racism, and the like that actually exist and have existed in our country for since its founding. So the title of my talk is Wired to Connect, the surprising link between brain science and strong, healthy relationship. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is both the cultural aspects of living life in America and some of the ways in which the excessive emphasis on separation and individuation actually may be working to undermine our health and well-being. And this comes out of a body of research that has been going on really for the past 15 to 20 years on the neuroscience of human relationship. And increasingly what is being shown and clear is that healthy human relationship, mutual human relationship, respect, empathy, all of these things that I think we toss around in our culture is absolutely integral not only to our emotional health and well-being, but also to our physical health and well-being. And in fact, one of the points that I really want to emphasize is that our culture, which so overemphasizes the idea of separating, individuating, standing on your own 2 feet, actually may be serving to undermine the very neurological pathways that we all need to be healthy human beings. So that's kind of a broad overview. We're going to be kind of weaving in a lot of different ideas, I think, over the course of this talk. And so I hope that you all kind of enjoy. The first thing I always start my talks with is this idea. It was a quote from a theologian, Walter Brueggemann, that a colleague pointed out to me many years ago. And what he said in his life work is that it's important to remember who's telling the story and whose interest the telling serves. And I hope that you can grasp in that quote the subjective nature of all of our experiences, right? And so this idea that we are, born dependent, and that the role of socialization and civilization is to create these individualistic, unique, separated adults, is, in my opinion, right, this is where I'm coming from, is mythology. And so I always like to own, right at the get-go, kind of where I'm coming from. And I come from a body of work called Relational Cultural Theory that was founded in Wellesley at the Stone Center, gosh, almost 40 years ago now. And at the time, a group of female scholars had gotten together, and they were questioning some of the theories that were so prevalent in mental health at the time, including this idea that growth and development was about separating and individuating. And what they began to really talk about and to educate other mental health counselors, and then now kind of where we are now is really trying to use it as the backbone of not only therapy and mental health, but also a social justice movement. And what they began to say publicly was that individuation, separation, is not the goal of development, but it's about being the capacity to form healthy human relationships. And so as we grow and develop, we become more richly interdependent with one another, and that relationship, healthy human relationship, sits at the very core and center of all health and well-being. So you will hear throughout the talk that is my bias. Of course, there are other fields of thought and other people that will still go in the other direction. But I feel that it's important to own both my bias and kind of where I'm coming from as you listen as we go along. So the work that I have done culminated in a program I developed called the CARE program. C-A-R-E. And what this does is it brings the field of neuroscience, relational neuroscience, it brings that together with this idea of what's called neuroplasticity, or the notion that our brains and our neural pathways can change and adapt over time. It sort of brings those two worlds together along with relational cultural theory into a way that folks can leverage their relationships to improve their brains, and improve their brains to then improve their relationships. So it's sort of that it's a Mobius strip, if you will. As you strengthen the pathways that we have for human connection, as you get clearer what they are, what they do, and what their purpose they serve, then you're able with the CARE program to take a relational assessment that you will look at your relationships and see what quality the relationships that you spend the most time in. What is the quality of those relationships? What's the impact they're having on your mind and your body? And then in turn, you can make a plan actually to try to strengthen those and strengthen the relationship. So that in a very short description is the CARE program. You can see on this slide that the three components, as I just mentioned, were this idea of relational cultural theory, the theory that I just named for you, RCT. I'll be referring to it as RCT for the rest of the talk, but that's one of the cornerstones, relational neuroscience, or the idea that we have these pathways for connection, and that it's very important for people to know what they are, to be able to use them to literally change their brains and change their relationships, and then finally neuroplasticity. And for people who don't know the term neuroplasticity, you probably have heard the ideas that come out of that movement or that research, which is use it or lose it, right? The more you stimulate a certain neural pathway, the stronger it gets. And if you don't use it, it tends to kind of atrophy and wither away and get weaker. Likewise, the second tenet of neuroplasticity is that when you have two kind of, whether it's ideas, actions, movements or whatever that are paired together, they tend to wire together. So pathways that fire together, wired together, so developing neural networks. And that's not only for things like playing the piano, but also for building relationships and interacting with people. So the pathways that I'm going to describe to you today actually are ones that you have the capacity, well, we all have the capacity to change, develop, grow, and strengthen. And that's kind of one of the more hopeful things, I think, that comes out of the current research on relational neuroscience. While I'm talking about this, though, I also want to be very clear that sort of clear the impact of COVID. Just last night, I actually talked to a reporter who was writing an article, if you can imagine, for the UK on the potential for social isolation and worsening health from COVID social isolation, and really trying to help her understand, as I'm going to try to help you understand through the rest of this talk, why that might be, right? Why framing the strategy of trying to contain the virus as social distancing actually, again, may be undermining our health and well-being. So one of the things I want to just kind of float out here, and hopefully I'll kind of knit back in over time, but is the idea that we need to start really being very clear that what we're doing to control the virus or try to contain the virus is not social distancing, it's physical distancing. Okay, so we know these, 6-foot distancing, the masks and whatnot, that's a physical thing, and it actually doesn't have anything to do with social interaction. So if you can begin to think of physical distance with social connection, you get a more healthy way of trying to approach containment of the virus while still preserving our humanity, in a sense, the heart and soul of what it means to be human, which is to be part of a family or a neighborhood or a community or whatnot, and that our health literally depends on that. very quickly, I had talked about relational neuroscience. Some people use the term interpersonal neurobiology. It's work that was done by Dan Siegel and his colleagues now all over the world, but it's sort of, it was one of the original groups that started looking at the neuroscience of human relationships. And these are just some of the kind of facts I want to put out there, or research findings that we find. First of all, healthy human relationships are essential for emotional and physical health and well-being. All human relationships exist within a larger context of culture, okay? So this is so important, right? The stew that we're in, I mean, we might be used to something like cognitive behavioral therapy where, you know, where a therapist says to you, okay, you need to stop those particular negative thoughts because they're training your brain to think a certain way, and then your behaviors follow that, right? But what we're talking about here is kind of behaviors writ large, right? So that all of the cultural interactions that we have, right? The unnamed biases that we all have, having grown up in a racist culture, the culture is 24/7, right? All the time influencing our pathways for connections, right? So we have a constant feedback system coming at us, even when we're not being intentional. And it comes by way of media and by way of how we interact with people that are different from us. I mean, you can imagine, culture is all-encompassing. You're going to have a different culture at home than you are at church, than you are at school, than you might at college. So, but all of those places, because we're so immersed in our we are immersed in our cultures all the time, those things also are shaping us on a moment-to-moment way. And I mean very concretely, it is shaping our nervous systems, okay? So all human relationships exist within a larger context of culture, and when you live in a culture that believes so strongly in separation and individuation, we pay a price, and we'll get to that as I go further. The third thing is a person's neural pathways for connection are literally developed in the earliest attachment relationships, which of course are impacted by multiple cultures and are reworked throughout life. So one of the things that's so exciting to me, and again, this certainly is my point of view, is you know, even the protests that are happening right now, or even the cultural shift that we've seen with people beginning to really get that dealing with COVID means wearing a mask, not necessarily just for yourself, not for your selfish individual reasons, but wearing a mask is as much, if not more, for other people, right? That's a cultural value. Do you value the other people around you, even if you don't know them as much as you do your own health? That's what wearing a mask is about. And, you know, and strangely, right, we've had a pretty huge, at least here in Massachusetts, a pretty huge cultural shift around that, where people, it's odd to go out now and not see somebody with a mask, right? So that's a huge cultural shift. So we have the capacity, right? We have the capacity to grow and even change our culture. That's what the protests are doing, right? All of a sudden, we've got cultural change, the NFL, NASCAR, you know, really changing their attitudes around very, you know, deep-seated racist ideas that have been in our country for a long time. So, you know, I want people to begin, you know, making those connections, that what we're seeing there on the streets is translating right up into each of our individual kind of neural pathways or neural networks in our brain. Louis Cozolino, who is one of the researchers and writers that I admire a lot in the field of relational neuroscience and interpersonal neurobiology, has, in one of his many books, had said that positive social interactions, and some of this is going to be kind of medical or scientific jargon that I'll translate for you, but positive social interactions result in increased metabolic activity, mRNA synthesis, and neural growth. Essentially what he's saying is relationships can create an internal environment of neuroplasticity, so being in healthy human relationships literally allows us to become more adaptable and more changeable. and that's a good thing, right? Because really survival of any individual as well as a community is very much based on our ability to change and adapt as the world adapts, as Earth adapts, as the universe does. Essentially, and these are his words, which I love, compassion, warmth, and love have the power to change the brain. That's a powerful, powerful statement, right? And I think, we don't often equate those two things, love and brain change, right? But here, this is exactly the essence of what I'm trying to share with you today, is that love changes the brain in very, very healthy ways, okay? So one of my colleagues, who's deceased now, Jean Baker Miller, she was one of the founding scholars of relational cultural theory. And she had an amazing ability to sort of use regular language to help people describe some of the ideas that she was talking about, which were quite radical in her time. In her time, in 1976, she wrote a book called Toward a New Psychology of Women. And once you open it, you realize it's not so much a new psychology of women, it's actually a new psychology or a psychology of human beings, and a psychology of dominance and subordination. So one of the things that was important to her is to begin to help people understand what a healthy relationship looked like, right? And this came out of studies that were done early, probably 20 plus years ago, where people were asked, what are the qualities of actually a healthy human being? And at the time, what people would describe is the qualities of then thought to be a healthy male, right? That people are unemotional, they're able to be kind of action-oriented. The notion that emotions don't get in the way of kind of planning activities. I mean, all of those kinds of things, and that being very hyper-independent. And what Jean was trying to do is help people understand this idea of healthy relationships. So she started in a really amazing place, right? Which was, how do you know if you're in a healthy relationship, right? And so she talked about the 5 good things in a growth-fostering relationship. I think we can substitute growth-fostering with mutual relationships, so one that has lots of respect, give and take. And these are the 5 things. And I have people literally try this on, and I would encourage you to, as you're sitting there watching, maybe take a relationship that you think is a strong one and see how these hold up, okay? So the first thing she said is that when you're in a healthy relationship, you have a feeling of zest or energy, right? We'll talk shortly about how that may be connected to stimulating the dopamine reward system and that burst of good positive energy that you get when you're having a good interaction or really a robust conversation with somebody. So it increases your energy. It allows you to have more action, both within that individual relationship, but also in the world. So again, you get more energy, you have more ability to act. You might be able to tell somebody you're angry when normally you wouldn't be able to do that, but it's a very action-oriented kind of feeling that you have. You have more clarity about yourself, about the other person, and about the relationship. So, one of the things that has come out of kind of a hyped up separation individuation model, and one thing that I have a little kind of nudge about is the idea of codependency, right? And I think until we have a culture where people are allowed to be interdependent and need one another, it's going to be really hard to find those folks that are codependent, right? So, I tend to just kind of push that along and have people think more about what is the quality of your relationships. If you're in a relationship where you're giving all the time and the person that you're in a relationship with is taking all the time, that's not mutual and that's probably not healthy, right? And probably needs to be changed. So clarity about yourself, the other person, and the relationship. You get an increased sense of self-worth. Okay, so, essentially this idea of self-esteem that is so bandied about, I would say, in mental health in our country comes very much from this idea that if we get enough goodies from the world, then we're going to have good self-esteem. We're going to be fine with who we are and how we are in the world. When in fact, it's much more interactive than that, right? Most of us, it's not that we only feel good about ourselves because of what we get from other people, but very much if we're, for instance, if we're being teased and bullied regularly, we get traumatized, depressed, we feel bad. And likewise, if we're being kind of supported and we get realistic feedback and, good feedback, even if it's somewhat critical, we feel a sense of clarity, an increased sense of agency, and more self-worth. Literally, we feel better about ourselves. And then finally, in this model, healthy relationship leads to more healthy relationship, right? You have a desire for more connection. One of the things that I keep seeing on Facebook is actually sort of this idea that, people are talking about Black Lives Matter, and then a group says, no, all my lives matter. Sort of this idea that relationships aren't just a pie, right? We're not dividing up the piece of the pie. We're saying we're saying relationships, people, and the desire for connection is universal, right? And so it's not that you can only have two. When you have good relationships, you want more good relationships. So it's sort of an expansive model. So again, a sense of increased energy, more ability to act, increased clarity, a sense of self-worth, and more desire for human connection. So let me segue. This is an exercise that, of course, we won't do here because I'm talking to a camera. But one of the things I do usually in workshops that I give is have people visualize a positive relational moment. I want to describe this to you because it is something that you could do at home, and it's something that I encourage both clients and people I'm working with to do as well, which is because our relationships live inside of us, right? We have neural networks for all of the people that are in our lives and how we feel about them and how we've interacted. Because of that, our relationships live inside us, and they're actually accessible to us all the time, right? Think about kind of research or studies that have shown that now if you imagine, so if you're a pianist or you're an athlete, if you visualize playing the piano or doing the activity, it actually makes you better, right? So visualizing, having your brain go through those motions actually makes those pathways stronger. It might not be the same as actually doing the activity. But likewise, if you are able to take a minute, and this is how long I have people do this exercise for, and literally try on one of their relationships. So I have people basically think of a recent interaction that you had with somebody that felt positive, and kind of visualize it, kind of do the narrative in your mind. Feel it in your body and the changes. And almost inevitably, what I have happen during these workshops is I start seeing people's faces. But one person will smile, somebody, their shoulders get more relaxed, and I go around and have people see what they noticed. And most people say, geez, I felt more relaxed. I could breathe more easily, right? And essentially what this is doing is changing your physiology from kind of where you were. Maybe you were stressed, maybe you weren't, but it's tapping into that physiology of human connection, the benefits of human connection. And it's something we can do all the time. I often will say to people, think about how often you feed yourself with your worst human interactions, right? The fight with your boss or the fight with your spouse, and how often we play that out over and over and over again, or the trouble with this one friend who keeps dissing you, or however you want to put it. That also, right, feeds you. That feeds your sympathetic nervous system or your stress response system. So essentially what I'm saying is we always have a choice of what we're feeding our nervous system. And if you have positive relationships in your life, for instance, I've literally had people, if they're going to have a conversation with their boss, they will sit for 1 or 2 minutes and visualize a positive relational moment, and then you are going to be walking into that interaction that may be difficult with a calmer sense of yourself, more clarity, all of those things that Jean talked about. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and do this quickly because really the bulk of the rest of the talk, I want to talk actually about the neural pathways for connection. This is a card that I saw somewhere and I just loved it. Babies are such a nice way to start people, right? However, unfortunately, what happens is we then put these babies into cultures, right? In this country, and I'm very specifically talking now about more westernized societies and cultures. The United States is, of course, the most exaggerated kind of form of what I'm talking about, power over cultures, right? So again, power over cultures, and I'll define that in a minute, work against human biology by creating, and they create stress and isolation. Okay, so what do I mean? Let me break that down. First, I want to give you just a little bit of evidence because it's important. That's just a quote by me. How are people being affected by power over culture? This is these are my connections, and again, as we get into the actual details of the neuroscience, hopefully this will be clearer to you. A third of U.S. adults are obese. Okay, so one of the things that in the United States we do, and I'm going to add this piece, which is we do instead of having healthy relationships, is that we tend to eat. We try to feed ourselves with other things, right? The United States leads the world in illegal drug use. We use drugs. As you're going to see, as we're going to talk about later, these are all things that stimulate the dopamine reward system, and I believe, and my colleagues believe, that it's a way that we're setting everybody up for various addictions. The average U.S. citizen uses 11 times more resources than a Chinese citizen, and 32 times as many as a Kenyan citizen. We're consumers, right? I mean, our entire, one of the pillars of our structure is the capitalism that tells you that, you know, you have value if you have more money, if you have more stuff. And then we have, you know, a whole system that allows you to get more stuff, right? To define yourself as somebody who has more stuff and therefore has more value, right? And I get that that's very simplistic, and I'm not, you know, I'm not trying to tout an anti-capitalist message. I'm instead trying to really kind of move relationship maybe to one of the forming pillars of how we set up our societies. Now this is a kicker, and most people are pretty surprised by this. There's a Bloomberg every year puts out a report on healthiest countries, and it's a very sophisticated measure based on things like, you know, kind of extent of illness, access to health care, smoking, you know, activities that undermine health and well-being, but there are many, many parameters that exist in that. They just updated their list in 2017, and in fact, the U.S. has dropped further. A few years ago when I gave this talk, I think the U.S. was around 32. It's dropped down to number 34 on Bloomberg's scale of healthiest countries. We're below Slovenia, Cuba, Chile, and the Czech Republic, okay? That's pretty stunning, right? So we have a lot of propaganda saying this is the best way to be. This separation, individuation, standing on your own 2 feet, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, being unique and individual, you know, competition, all of those things that we get fed right from the get-go aren't making us healthier, okay? I would argue just the opposite. They're making us much unhealthier. And here you can see this is simply the Bloomberg scale and how far down we are. You can see healthiest countries in 2017, Italy, Iceland, Switzerland, Singapore, Australia, Spain, Japan. So many of our fellow or our, you know, countries, westernized countries are in the same boat, but they aren't in the same health crisis that the United States is. Years ago, 1998 now, there was a study, the ACE study, that is infamous within the field of mental health, done by a group in California. It's been followed and quoted, and partly because it was a good study, a large study. And what they looked at is kind of the risk of chronic disconnections. A few things from this study. Number one, so they looked at, you know what, I'm going to fast forward to one other slide. They defined, first of all, they defined risky families, right? And so how they defined risky family was the risky families had no history of a severe abuse, so they were screening out, you know, major physical abuse, sexual abuse, that sort of thing. Lots of tension, lack of affection, neglect, chaos, and chronic disconnections. So the first thing that is so important about this study, and I'll go back, is that a third of almost 14,000 members of an HMO were defined as risky. So that picture of unengaged, kind of neglectful, not the kind of warm, holding kind of thing, was fairly epidemic in the families. What they also saw is in those families that had more risky behaviors, there was an increase not just in mental health issues, right? So you might think, okay, more depression, more substance abuse, but also more risk of every other illness, from sexually transmitted disease to heart disease to bronchitis, hepatitis, everything. So basically being in a risky family, being disconnected makes you less healthy, okay? And finally, the last thing I want to kind of refer people to is this book that was written by Dean Ornish about, I don't know, sometime in the last 10 years. He was, for anybody who remembers that name, Dean Ornish, he was a famous cardiologist, still is. And so he has spent his life looking at, kind of the risk factors that would cause coronary artery disease, heart disease of all kinds. And out of the blue, 10 years ago or so, he wrote this book called Love and Survival, the scientific basis for the healing power of intimacy. Basically, what he has done is synthesize all the studies that document why, or not even why, but the fact, the scientific fact that being disconnected, losing a spouse, being abused, being alone for a prolonged period of time, all of those things actually have huge health impacts. And in fact, this is a quote that he says, now mind you, this is from a cardiologist who is, making his living and his career based on trying to intervene in heart disease. And he says, I'm not aware of any other factor in medicine, not diet, not smoking, not exercise, not stress, not genetics, not drugs, not surgery, that has a greater impact in our quality of life, incidence of illness, and premature death from all causes. That's a profound statement, right? He's saying, think of all of the attention we spend doing things like trying to quit smoking, trying to exercise, trying to reduce our stress, and he's saying, work on your relationships, right? Being disconnected trumps all of that. If you need one thing to work on your relationships. And you might ask, where did that go, right? The book was actually a bestseller at the time, and my guess is most people haven't heard of it. My theory is that partly we don't hear about these things because if you imagine, it's sort of this piece of scientific literature that completely clashes with the cultural expectations of being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want. Again, I'm reminded of the folks that are, saying, okay, we want to be able to decide whether we wear a mask or not. It's not up to the government or whoever is making these policies about masks. We want to be able to decide. It's our life. And what we're saying is, no, actually, we need to make this decision as a community, and it's got to be based on scientific fact. And just throwing off the mask for civil liberties is inherently that, kind of the ultimate selfish thing to do, in a sense. Now, mind you, I'm aware I don't have a mask on, but I'm not within 6 feet of anywhere. All right, so let me switch gears now again and switch over to really talking about what I call the 4 neural pathways of connection. Okay, and I think that as I go through each of these, I hope that you're going to get a clearer sense of, why human connection is so important, and also I hope to begin to really think about the new strategies around COVID, even to stay in social connection despite needing to be physically distant. Again, that's one of the major messages that I really want to give in this talk. Okay, so again, I had referenced the CARE program that I had kind of developed in order to kind of leverage our neural pathways for connection in order to improve our health and our relationships. CARE, so a deeper look at that, CARE is an acronym for 4 for qualities that we find in healthy relationships, okay? So the first is, C is for a sense of calm that we get when we're in healthy relationships. And it very specifically is reflective of activity of something called the smart vagus nerve. And again, I'm just going to introduce these here now. I'll go into them in a little more detail in a few minutes. A, one of the hallmarks of healthy relationships is a sense of acceptedness, right? Non-judgmentalness. And that references work that was done by Eisenberger and Lieberman. It's a theory called spot theory or social pain overlap theory. R is a sense of resonance. So the ability to read other people's actions, intentions, and feelings is key to human interaction. And this is reflective of a system called mirror neurons that, again, in the last 20 years have been discovered and are really quite exciting, but also disturbing depending on what you're seeing, right, and what you're witnessing in other people. And finally, E is for a sense of heightened energy, which reflects the activity of the dopamine reward system. So care is calm, accepted, resonant, and energetic. That's what care stands for. So let's go into each one of those a little bit more deeply. Now, I understand from this slide that this might sound a little too scientific, so I will kind of do the translation for people that aren't familiar with some of the biology, okay? So again, C is for calm, and it represents the capacity for your smart vagus nerve to modulate, to kind of shape and help balance the autonomic nervous system. So basically, what do I mean? This is what I mean. Do your relationships help you feel calm? To the extent that they do, you have a very active smart vagus nerve, okay? Let me talk about that a little bit more. So picture evolutionarily, right? When we, went from, as we evolved as human beings, right? One of the things that happened is that we evolved away from turtles, right? Turtles, reptiles would lay a bunch of eggs, right? The idea of survival was if I lay enough eggs, then 1 or 2 or 3 may survive, hatch, and actually make it to the water, right? So there's not a whole, like, I've got to raise my young, right? I just need to make enough so that some of them can make it. And that's a survival strategy. That's an older evolutionarily, it's older survival system. So what happened, of course, by the time we got to mammals, is that we went to growing the organisms, the babies, whatever you want to call them, inside of us. And so all of a sudden we had to develop a system of attachment, right? So we birth, you know, kind of immature, if you will, or certainly not self-sufficient individuals, and that the task then of parenting, of society or whatever, is to try to grow and develop these little creatures into a state of mature interdependency, right? But what it means is there had to be an attachment system to keep our young close. That's where the smart vagus came. So the smart vagus nerve originated evolutionarily with mammals, okay? So, you know, I like to say your cats and your dogs probably have it, and many other mammals have a smart vagus. You know, your frogs don't, right? And what it is, so let me, it's the newest branch of the autonomic nervous system. So let me just say kind of a couple words about the autonomic nervous system. So for those of you who haven't had Bio 101, that is the part of your nervous system that operates all the time, kind of 24/7, without your conscious control. Most people are familiar with it as having 2 branches: the sympathetic nervous system, which most people have heard of, the sympathetic or the stress response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of the branch that's kind of more rest and relax. And so when I was even in medical school, you know, a long time ago now, but still not long ago enough that we shouldn't know more about this, I was told that these are complementary systems, and that the sympathetic nervous system kind of at its basis, when you're awake, gives you energy, helps you focus, and do the action of your day. In times of high stress, right, it is the one that causes you to be adrenalized, stressed out. The parasympathetic was just the opposite. It kind of tends to kick in at night. You rest, you relax, you slow things down. And that this complementary system was happening kind of all the time. But that was it. So along came Steve Porges, who's doing work out in Illinois, who was looking at respiratory rates, heart rates, and stuff in infants. And he found this new pathway that he named the smart vagus nerve. So what it is, that the sympathetic nervous system kind of goes into your kind of from your brain into your body, into your large muscles, so that you can flee or fight. Parasympathetic similarly. But what the smart vagus does is it goes north and goes up into the muscles of facial expression. So when you smile, when your eyes, when you greet somebody and your eyes open, you extend your eyebrows. Usually there's an opening in your face. It's in the little teeny muscles in your inner ear for hearing and your throat for both swallowing and speaking, okay? The entire purpose of the smart vagus nerve is to modulate your stress when you're in healthy relationships. For those neuroscience buff, it's a myelinated branch of what's called cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, which means myelinated means it goes a little faster than things that aren't myelinated. So it's the transmission of the signal is quick. It controls vocalization, hearing, expression. And essentially what happens is that when I move into an environment where I have friendly people or safe people, I usually brighten up. I might be speaking, I might be listening a little more attentively. But essentially that all sparks a signal from the smart vagus. It fires, the smart vagus fires and sends a signal to the sympathetic nervous system to de-stress, okay? That's how safe relationships directly allow you to feel more calm, okay? Porges came up with this concept of neuroception, and he said it's used to distinguish the neural circuitry that is used to respond to the environment, automatically respond to the environment. So when we're safe, and it's hierarchical, right? If we go out into an environment and we feel safe, the smart vagus kicks in, we feel calm. If we go into an environment and we actually feel like there's some danger, then you want your sympathetic nervous system to activate to either fight or flee, right? So your stress response is there for danger. And finally, in life-threatening, and I didn't mention this, but the parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and relax, also plays a duplicate role in life-threatening stress, where, in fact, you freeze, okay? The rest and relaxation stimulation is so intense that you literally freeze, right? And for animals or humans or whatever that are in acute immediate danger, that often looks like, kind of just a freeze response. I can't talk, I can't act, I can't whatever. And it's designed to both protect you. It's thought evolutionarily that if you're not moving, if you appear dead, in fact, then maybe the predator will walk away. But also, if you are being hurt, there's an enormous outpouring of opioids and other chemicals that in fact protect you from the overwhelming pain of being dead. So again, neuroception is how does your body respond to the environment, and when you feel safe, basically the smart vagus is going to respond, and that helps calm you down. So essentially, this is one of the slides I use to say, who would you rather connect with, right? Somebody on the left is the cat that has high sympathetic nervous system tone. On the right is the smart vagus, right? Cuddly, calm, engaged. So think about all of these pathways that I'm going to talk to you about. I've got 3 more coming, but they're all started in those earliest attachment relationships, right? So what you see is safe is very dependent on how safe you were as a child, right? And when we start to begin to even consider whether it's, if you want to call it implicit bias, racism, or whatever, the fact that we are wired from the moment of birth, actually probably way before the moment of birth, and that keeps happening makes us have to take really seriously the ways our culture is impacting these neural pathways for connection, right? I'm trying to think of an example. I think people are always wondering, well, why would a police officer get paired with a frightening response, right? Well, how would those kind of wire together for, let's say, black people? How many images do you have to see of police or, people of color or the Klan or whatever? How many images of those do you have to see before you realize that it is life-saving to pair these images generally with your stress response system? So, and the reverse will happen as well. If you have not been exposed to various different cultures, different ethnicities or whatever, then difference gets coded as scary or dangerous. And so we have to take this into account when we're really trying to begin to untangle this mess of racism, quite frankly. Now, so one of the things that neuroscientists will ask themselves or other people now is, do you have good vagal tone? And what does that mean? It means as adults, good vagal tone allows us to become upset or angry at a loved one without withdrawing, which would be the withdrawal response would be more parasympathetic, or becoming physically aggressive, right? So if in fact you're in conflict, right? Certainly in our model, conflict is necessary in relationships, right? We have to be in conflict. Anger is necessary in relationships. Violence is not necessary, but those kinds of feelings inform us about how we are doing in the world, whether the world feels safe or not safe, right? And as I said just a few minutes ago, the ability of the vagal system to regulate both your heart rate and other target organs is very dependent on childhood experience. This is just one of a more benign, maybe, examples of this. Mother comes in, the son's smashing some light, I guess, against the wall, and she said, "Use your words, hon," right? That's a kid, and of course that makes sense. That's a kid that is more impulsive, right? Doesn't have as much vagal tone, if you will, and so is acting that out. So again, the smart vagus is part of a system, a social engagement system that helps us feel safe and calmer when we're in healthy relationships. Imagine, so one of the things that's going on right now, right, even with the mask thing, right, is all of these pathways need kind of ongoing stimulation in order to, it's like a muscle, in order to stay robust and active. If you put a mask on your face, right, you've just wiped out half of your smart vagus stimulation, right? So that actually matters. One of the things that I do when I have the mask on is I tend to notice, and not everybody does this, but a lot of people, it makes us very myopic, right? It's sort of like we have the mask on, therefore we can't look at anybody. But it's important, actually, to, in these times where we do have to wear a mask to protect the other person, that we also maybe go out of our way to reach out, maybe on a Zoom call where you don't have to have the mask, maybe on a FaceTime, whatever. Maybe in a socially distanced, 10-foot space where you can have a conversation at a far where you don't have the mask on. But also to, when you have the mask on, if you're passing another human being, look them in the eye, right? Say hello. That's still the hello. You're stimulating your own smart vagus nerve, but you're also stimulating the other person's ears, hearing, and the whole eyes. All of that stimulates the smart vagus nerve. So it's like, let's not put our masks on and go kind of in and myopic and be scared, right? Let's do it with full confidence that we still need to interact with other people, that we need each other to maintain these systems. Okay, let me go now to A is for accepted. And again, this is a very kind of wordy way of describing this. It reflects the ability of your dorsal anterior cingulate, Gyrus, to help you feel you belong or accepted. Let's break that down. So this is a group of researchers, Eisenberger and Lieberman at UCLA. And they wanted to see what happens when people are socially excluded. So they set up a pretty benign social exclusion experiment, if you will. They had people come into a lab. And they would sit in front of the person that they're actually looking at through imaging, functional imaging techniques. That person is sitting in front of a computer, like I am here, And on the computer is 3 kind of doughy, those white doughy looking people. And the person is told that their task is to actually play ball toss, computer ball toss, with 2 other people that are controlling the other dough people. And so a person comes in, they're starting to play that game. Slowly, they're very specifically left out of the game. Okay, so a couple of things. One, this isn't actually even being left out of people. It's imagined people. It's imagined that there are other people on the other side of the game, right? So this isn't homophobia. This isn't racism. This is like being left out of a ball toss game. So the stress of it, you'd think, not such a big deal. But by and large, almost everybody, or the vast majority of people that did this, as they were being left out, they actually felt bad. You could see it. You could see it in their demeanor, and they could describe it to you, that they felt bad. And so what the researchers did is they thought, okay, this is curious. Let's look at what area of the brain is activated when people feel bad, when they're socially excluded. So what they looked at this area, they saw that was activated, called the DACC, Dorsal Anterior Cingulate Gyrus. The name of that doesn't matter. What does matter is that it is the exact same area in the brain that registers and fires for the distress of physical pain. Okay? So this is the first time that researchers had seen this human overlap. They may not be human, maybe mammal, but that physical pain, injury, illness is so important. Social exclusion, so being belonging, being part of a tribe, being part of a community is so important to the human body that we're literally sharing the pain alarm system with the one that controls for physical injury or illness. Okay? That's huge. The stress of being socially excluded is as bad as being injured or ill, right? And really let that sink in, okay? Let that sink in as we're trying to confront this epidemic of racism in our country, the enormous and relentless divisive rhetoric that goes on in political circles these days. Take that in, right? This is real pain. This is real pain to our body with all of the sequelae that you would have with a chronic illness. So essentially what they're saying is social exclusion and perceived social exclusion can be deadly. And perceived is really important because as human beings, one of the kickers, right, for us is that once we have a neural pathway coded, once we have an experience of social exclusion, particularly when that's repeated over time, is it can then actually shift the way we see other social interactions, right? I see this all the time in my practice, maybe with people that have been traumatized and really abused and neglected, and that it is, they don't always see kind of a reassuring smile as reassuring, right? It might look more like ridicule, like I'm messing with them or something. So this is really crucial, this idea that a history of social exclusions make make more social exclusion down the line that much more painful. The dorsal anterior cingulate, where is it for those brain people? It's right there. It's sort of deep in the, if you cut your brain in half here, it's kind of deep below, in back of the frontal lobe, basically, for what it's worth. One of the things that I'm advocating for, and I think most of you, if you've been to the doctor lately, and by lately I mean the last 10 years or so, you'll see that there's this new norm, right, where everybody is assessing for pain, right? I mean, I've never tracked this down, but I'm assuming at some point people realized, or researchers realized, that chronic pain actually led to further chronic illness, right? The stress of chronic pain makes you more susceptible to illness. And so, you go in, what level is your pain? And what I'm saying is, if we take this research seriously, we need to be doing this around social pain as well, right? Not just physical pain, right? But social exclusion. All of a sudden, I think when you begin to look at that, stuff starts to pop out, right? Social exclusion. If you're black in America, Why are you dying at exceedingly higher rates than people that are white, right? Social exclusion, bias. That's not just about are they getting the same kind of care, it's about the wear and tear of social exclusion on our bodies and our brains. Here's a study that was done a few years ago that should disturb all of us, I think. This was some researchers who looked at differences in assessing pain levels, okay, between black kids and white kids. And so basically they took a group of white kids at 5 years old and they told them this story about another kid and then showed them a picture of a kid that's either white or black, okay, so a story of some pain. And then the child at 5 years old is supposed to rate the level of pain that they think that child has. At 5 years old, the kids, by and large, don't differentiate black pain from white pain. Same thing, right? Pain is pain is pain. People are people are people. What they see, though, between the ages of 7 to 10, is that white kids, the white kids they studied, started to minimize the pain of black kids, right? So all of a sudden, same story, same level of pain, you present a black face versus a white face, and all of a sudden the white person is rated as having more pain than the black person. The black people's pain is being seen less and less and less and less, right? To me, that's staggering. And you see this follows all the way up to literally medicine, where there have been studies that show that in the United States, black people tend to get far less pain medicine than white people, right? Basically, their pain is minimized. This is a slide of, obviously, Mother Teresa. And I love this quote, "If you judge people, you have no time to love them." How does that fit into this? This is a lame attempt at a brain joke, right? That we are so involved in judging people in this country that we've created this new brain pathway called the insulta. It's actually not true. We do have an insula, but it's not insulta. Anyway, think about what power over cultures do, right? When everybody is pitted against each other for, resources, in a sense, right? Survival of the fittest, that idea. Power over cultures pit individuals against each other in a competition for social capital. What does that do? What it often does is when we kind of come together across difference is no longer a kind of a curiosity. This difference becomes a threat, right? So I come, I meet you, maybe I like your hair better than mine, so all of a sudden I'm judging myself about my hair. Maybe it's the color of my skin, maybe it's my sexual orientation, whatever it is. But oftentimes, and I do this in workshops, is I have people begin to track how often they have judgmental thoughts, right? Most of us have them a lot, right? And maybe you're judging yourself, maybe you're judging someone else, but that there's a steady stream of kind of assessment and evaluation and kind of figuring out where you are in this pecking order that happens for most people. When difference all of a sudden gets judged, it then gets stratified, right? Someone wins, someone loses. That's the great kind of, competitive system, right? There's winners and losers. That's it. When that happens, when you come together across difference, you judge, you stratify, all of a sudden in that stratification, there's a social rejection. I believe that chronic judgment that we have, right? And it's not about, it's really about, are you valued as a human being, right? I mean, I'm going to point out some of the, places that we see this, the immigration, the folks that are at the border, right? That they literally seem to have less value for some people in this culture, right? Not that they just don't want them there competing with their jobs, but they're less value, right? They don't matter as much as other people. So essentially because we don't deal with difference in our country, we are constantly judging, stratifying, and causing pain over and over and over, right? Pain pathways are being stimulated over and over and over. Okay, let me move on to R is for resonance, and this reflects the functioning of your mirror neuron system, which allows you to read other people's actions, intentions, and feeling and feel a resonance with them. What does that mean? Essentially, that means that putting yourself in another one's shoes is very literal. This is work that was done actually by a group of, originally by a group of researchers in Parma, Italy, Rizzolatti and some others. And they weren't looking for mirror neurons, these kind of magical things that allow us to intuit what other people are doing, feeling, seeing. They were actually just studying macaque monkeys, and they were studying this one area of the brain. It's called F5, and it's an area of the macaque monkey brain that actually codes for grasp reflex, right? So as the story goes, that grasp reflex, you know, for instance, if a macaque monkey is going to grasp something, basically it would fire and send a little signal that would be measured on a monitor in their lab. One day, as people were just moving around apparently in the lab, that started firing. So on a specific macaque monkey, the F5 started firing on the registers, yet the monkey wasn't reaching for anything, okay? That was really curious. So what they started to kind of slow it down, break it down, and at first they thought, well, the monkey must have moved his arm or her arm a little bit, but it didn't. And then what they saw is that the monkey was watching another person or another monkey grab for something. So all of a sudden, one monkey here, let's say I'm the monkey, is just watching another person or another animal grab for something, and the area in their own brain fired as if they were grabbing as well. Right? And that was blasphemous in neuroscience at that time. We were heavily invested in the model of one location, one function. You know, if I'm watching you, a sensory pathway could fire, but not a motor pathway that's controlling my arm. So they looked more and more closely. And come to find out, what emerged from this research over many, many years, actually a couple decades, was this idea that we have a mirror neuron system. And what that means is that one of the ways, or probably the most important way that we understand each other is by mimicking them. And so that monkey, for instance, knew that other monkey was reaching, literally knew in his own body what it felt like for that other monkey to reach for something, because in his brain he was doing it too. Come to find out, as research kind of went forward, that is involved in everything we do in reading other people. We use, and so what one researcher, Christian Kiesers, has kind of conceptualized is this idea that we basically, they're not specialized neurons, but they're specialized circuits of neurons that are coded inside us based on what we have seen, what we have felt, what we have been a part of in our life around activity, feelings, sensations, emotions, and that we reference those and activate those same pathways in synchrony with another person in order to have an embodied feeling of what that person is seeing, doing, actions, behaviors, and actions, behaviors, and sensations. Okay, so let me get concrete about this. Okay, this is my Mr. Burns slide, and I don't know that this will work over TV, but basically I'm going to rub my hands together, and if you can pay close attention to my hands, I don't know if you can hear the sound. But usually when I do this, right, and there's an audience, what will happen is the people will begin to feel their hands tingling, right? They might feel a little warm. And what I say is that's mirror neurons in action, right? You're witnessing me rubbing my hands together, and you have now activated, if your hands were tingling or warm, you have activated your own pathway where you're rubbing your hands together even though you're not moving. You've pulled in a sensory pathway into this network where you can feel the friction and the heat. That's in the parietal lobe, right? For some people, they might actually also feel that I get a little special glee when I do this because I think it's fun. And so is some of the emotional resonance with what I'm feeling when I do this comes about. But that's how concrete it is. So when I'm talking to you, there actually have been studies that show that your area of your brain, the Broca area, is also activated as if you're talking to, right? So understanding I'm not going to read this. It's too long, and I don't think it's necessary. But essentially what this says is that the way we read other people's actions, emotions, and sensations, right, they come together from these pathways in the premotor cortex that plans and executes actions for behavior, for motor actions. We pull in the emotions through the insula, which is a pathway to literally our visceral feeling, emotions. And then finally, sensations, we pull in the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. At birth, all of these three areas are kind of loosely connected. And experience, when they fire together, they wire together, they get stronger. So the more you read other people through your intuitions, the stronger your intuition in your mirror neuron system becomes. Okay? I'm going to pass on those two. Now this is key. So basically I'm saying this is really concrete, right? But there's also, if you think about it, you can mimic what somebody else is feeling, but you don't always understand how they're making sense of that feeling, right? So you can have a similar feeling to somebody, but you might put on the wrong meaning system, right? So actually, I will go back. This idea of empathy in two parts. We have kind of a slightly different pathway to cognitively understand what somebody's seeing, kind of perspective taking, versus having the same distress somebody's having. It can be split off. They tend to, in our culture, split off at this point around gender, right? So men are usually, when it's measured, men are able to judge what somebody is feeling, but they don't have the same level of physical visceral reactivity that women might have. So that's just interesting, right? What is cause and what is effect, and what is male, female versus learned behavior. I don't think anybody's really teased that out. As I go back, and probably I don't know if this will show, but there was a study on that a researcher did on power in the brain. And again, this is about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to do it I'm not going to play the video right now for the sake of time. But basically what this video shows is that when somebody is given power, and what they did, they called it a Cookie Monster experiment. They brought people in to, as the researcher says, do really boring tasks like writing reports or what have you. And they put down, 3 people, they put down a plate of 4 cookies. And they're told to do this task, and then they're kind of monitored. And usually what happens is that the first go around, each of the 3 people takes a cookie, right? Because there's 3. Now there's 1 left over. Over and over again, what they saw is that the person who was put in charge of the group, power of the group, right, would take the 4th cookie, not by asking. They just assumed that by virtue of them being, kind of in charge, they had more power, therefore they got the other cookie. And then what they noticed, and as they did more research, including imaging, is that when people are given more power, their empathy pathways, their resonance, their feeling resonance with other people decreases, right? That's a pretty powerful statement in a power over culture, and helps to explain some of what we begin to see as people get more power, then lose their connection to the feelings and experiences with people that they are then have power over. So this is my final slide for different pathways for knowing people, whether it's similar or different, whether we use different pathways if we think somebody's similar versus different, okay? So if we, and again, this is completely subjective, right? It doesn't, you can think you're similar but have different skin color or have different sexual orientation or be from a different country. It's whether subjectively you feel that the other person is similar to you. When it is, you tend to use the mirror neuron system to resonate and feel them. However, if you go out into an environment and you already are feeling that these people are different from me, you shut down your mirror neuron system by and large, and you use kind of more of an abstract reasoning, kind of more way to try to understand this other people. So it's like you're trying to understand, like, what is a podium for? So rather than feeling the other person, you're using kind of more cognition to try to make sense of them. And I think that's one of the really tricky things in our culture, is that when we don't, when we have so much dissimilar, and that gets focused on more and more and more, then it emphasizes the ability to kind of back up, take 10 steps back, and make sense of somebody else through a cognitive lens. It's not helpful, basically. So bridging difference is to me, it's one of the key things that we need to start teaching kids, from the time they're born, essentially. All right. So let me finish up this care part by talking about E pathway. E is for energy, and this reflects the degree to which the dopamine stimulation is attached to healthy relationship, so that connections produce energy and motivation. As I like to say in the beginning, whenever that was, the dopamine reward system, which people, a lot of people hear about the dopamine reward system in relation to addictions, right? That people who are addicted, their dopamine reward system gets hijacked. All things that we do repetitively over and over and over again tend to, get into our dopamine reward system. And dopamine is a chemical or neurotransmitter that does a lot of things, but most importantly, it helps with motivation. It helps with feeling good, feeling better, all of that kind of stuff. So it's one that everybody wants, right? Most people want to feel good. In the beginning, when we were born, food, nurturance, water, reproduction, all of those things were tied to the dopamine reward system. And most importantly, perhaps, relationships. So being cuddled, being held, being talked to, reading a book in bed, all of those things can cause a hit of dopamine as an adult. If you have kept your dopamine reward system attached to a healthy relationship, then a good conversation with your friend gives you the energy, the motivation for you to be able to do whatever you have to do next, right? So it's kind of a sustaining, it's a huge sustaining biological pathway. But, so I always like to, I tend to be somebody that likes a lot of dopamine, what I like to say is everybody wants to feel good, right? So it's not that people are just craving dopamine, right? I mean, that's kind of a natural thing. It's what we do to relationships that I think really set people up. So what happens when we isolate people we deem different? Or what happens when we say that COVID, strategies for COVID are about social distancing, right? Rather than physical distancing with social connection. I mean, essentially, right from the get-go, when we begin to, tell kids that you shouldn't, you can't lean on one another when, that being, you can be too needy, or, if you need reassurance, you're a wimp, or however that gets framed, right? And it, of course, varies in degrees based on kind of what family you're in, what culture you're in. But essentially what happens is early on, we begin to separate the dopamine reward system from healthy relationship. And therefore, people are going to look for other ways to try to get their dopamine stimulated. It's just because it's that important a hormone. This is one of my favorite slides. I need a dopamine fix, so I'm going on a power trip. And of course, going on a power trip, having power over others, can often give you a quick hit of dopamine. The problem is you have to keep getting more and more power. You have to keep demonstrating more and more power over others in order to keep that up. So it's, it's how power over others and power, when power is held in that way, it tends to be all about the power rather than, really helping people kind of deal or manage or legislate or govern, for instance. But there are many ways that we can stimulate the dopamine reward system, right? Drugs, overeating, sex addiction, materialism. This is just a small list of them, right? But the bottom line is that in a culture that doesn't value relationship, as we pathologize people who are codependent, who are needy, who are, turning to somebody else before they pass in a paper, however you want to frame it, when we begin to pathologize that, we detach dopamine from healthy relationships, and it sets people up to need to get their dopamine other ways, right? Including all of the addictions that I think are so prevalent in our country. As I'm winding down, there's a couple of slides left. Let me say this. So healing, what is healing? Healing involves reestablishing the connection between reward circuitry and healthy relationship. That's one definition, right? To me, healing is about integration, and I mean that on a microscopic, biological level to a cultural level, right? It's about interaction, it's integration, it's about being able to come together in a cooperative nature, right? In order to function. We need that with every single organ system in our body. We know families need that. We know communities need that. We know nations need that. We know the whole planet needs that. When we hyper-focus on individualism, we lose that. We begin to dissociate, right? We begin to disintegrate. And I think that's kind of what's before us right now. So let me end by this. So kind of, in thinking about COVID, thinking about people that are marginalized, kind of the impact of isolation on these four pathways. I hope that it's obvious to you now that being able to stimulate these pathways and have a robust system inside of you to use to interact with other people is both better for your health and well-being, right? You're going to be less stressed. We know that less stress means a more robust immune system. It protects you from other diseases. So the impact of isolation on the four pathways of connection are as follows. It has the potential in this period of time where we're talking about social distance as opposed to physical distance. It increases the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So it basically increases stress. It increases the reactivity of the dorsal anterior cingulate gyrus, the DACC. People often end up feeling perpetually excluded, right? And I think that the loneliness, we already had a loneliness epidemic in our country, right? But I think that is getting worse and will get worse with the way that we are framing the COVID pandemic. And again, I'm not saying everybody needs to rush in and get on the beach together, but what I am saying is we need to find really innovative ways to interact with each other with our masks and at a safe physical distance. The decrease in interpersonal resonance and accurate reading of others through the mirror neuron system. So again, the mirror neuron system needs to have kind of perpetual activation. We need to keep reading people in order to be able to keep reading people accurately. And when we're isolated, when we're set aside, apart, that decreases because we just don't have the stimulation. And finally, chronic disconnection of dopamine from healthy relationships results in an increased risk for addictions. And I think one of the things that people are talking about in a kind of joking way, I remember actually a client of mine sent me a email kind of earlier in the pandemic saying something to the effect of, okay, are we going to go to Weight Watchers first or AA first, right, when the pandemic ends? And I think basically what they're saying is the loneliness is causing people to turn to other ways to get their dopamine. People are overeating. People are using substances, right? And I get it. Some of it is just boredom, coping, absolute terror that they're not going to be able to feed their families. I mean, there's a lot of things that are playing into it that are making people want to escape. But again, my thought is that if we can take this, kind of head on with physical distancing, but an absolute insistence, if you will, that everybody reaches out to another person or two or three every single day. Even if you don't need it, there are people out there that do need it, that might not be able to reach out. Finally, and I'll end on this, again, this is from my mentor, Jean Baker Miller. She redefined power, and I think it's such a powerful message to think about not power over other people, right? Not getting people, again, not getting people to conform to our will, if you will. But it's the capacity to produce change, to facilitate movement, to induce responsive, to move and be moved by another. That's a relational concept of power, and I think it's one we all ought to strive for, and I think it's one that, quite frankly, will support our health and well-being individually, community-wise, as well as the entire planet. I'll end on that. Here's some information about me, my website. There is a relational assessment on my website. You could actually take the CARE relational assessment, and there is some information about the CARE program. I have a blog through Psychology Today called Wired for Love. And please check us out at Relational Cultural Theory at growthandconnection.org. Thank you, stay safe, and stay connected.